In this lecture, I plan to discuss the campaign and Battle of Gaugamela, which is often referred to also as the Battle of Arbela. It depends on whether you name the battle after the village very close to where the battle was fought or the nearest town. The nearest town is Arbela, a town in what was then ancient Assyria, today northern Iraq. The battle was fought on the 1st of October in 331 BC. We do know the date because some 10 days earlier, on September 20th of that year, there was a lunar eclipse. It was seen by Alexander's army. Many wondered what the portent meant, and Alexander confidently explained that the Persian moon was being eclipsed, that the lunar eclipse foretold the great victory that the Macedonians would win over Darius III. The battle is, in some ways, perhaps, I really think it's probably Alexander's most inspired. He fought this battle on essentially a level plain. We know the general vicinity of it, but not the precise location, and there seems to have been very, very little in the way of any kind of topographical features. It was an open plain that favored the Persian army. Darius III had somewhere between 200 and 250,000 men on the field. The ancient sources rate this army much higher, but we suspect these are grossly exaggerated. What was important is he probably fielded some 35,000 cavalry. He did have 2,000 Greek mercenaries at that battle. These would be heavy-armed hoplites, the only infantry expected to match the Macedonian phalanx. He also had 1,000 apple bearers, as they were called. That is Persian infantry, the Persian infantry guard. Their armament is still a matter of question whether they could actually meet a phalanx or they were more armed as traditional Persian warriors, depending on wicker shields and bows and arrows rather than the thrusting spear and body armor of Greek and Macedonian infantry. The vast majority of the army comprised subjects from the eastern satrapies, and their armament differed. They came in their national dress, they fought under their own commanders, and they would be drawn up in a secondary line and not expected to do any kind of serious service until the battle had been won by the Iranian cavalry and the Greek mercenaries. Alexander's force was perhaps some 45,000, certainly under 50,000 men. The Persian cavalry came close to numbering the same size as Alexander's army. So there was a great disparity, maybe 5 or 6 to 1 against Alexander. But again, it was a question of discipline, the ability of Alexander's officers, Alexander's inspired leadership, and that supreme quality of any great commander to impose his will on the battlefield from the start. As we shall see, Alexander had the initiative almost from the word go. Let us back up for a moment and put Gaugamela in its wider context. In the spring of 331 BC, the Macedonian army had spent about 6 months in Egypt, and as I had mentioned, probably this was the most fun winter quarters they were ever to have. They marched out of Egypt early in the spring, crossing the Sinai, supported by the Phoenician and Cypriot fleets, and rendezvoused at Tyre with other forces, reinforcements and replacements coming from Europe. Alexander actually met a delegation of Athenians at Tyre. Tyre is at that point being rebuilt. The city had been taken a year earlier when Alexander punished the Tyrians for not allowing him to sacrifice to their god Melkart. And Alexander very generously released those Athenian prisoners who had been sent to the quarries, and these were the men who had fought as mercenaries at the Battle of the Granicus. And Alexander could afford to be increasingly generous to many of the Greek allies because he was decidedly winning the war against Darius III, and the only opposition in Greece was King Aegeus III of Sparta, and most Greeks were not particularly anxious to line up with the Spartans. And shortly after the Battle of Gaugamela, Antipater defeated and slew King Aegeus III at the city of Megalopolis, and Sparta was incorporated into the Greek League. So the threat in the backfield in the Greek world is essentially disappearing by the time Alexander moved out of Egypt into Asia. The army moved north to cross the Euphrates. It crossed at the same point that the 10,000 did, a city called Thapsacus on the upper Euphrates. There were pontoon bridges thrown across the river. Alexander's army advanced in very, very swift order. There was a Persian force there, some 3,000 cavalry. Actually, most of them were Greek mercenaries, we suspect, under Matthias, the then governor, that is satrap of Syria. Matthias tried to shadow Alexander's army and give reports to Darius back in Babylon as to what direction Alexander intended to move. As in 401 BC, when Cyrus the Younger invaded Mesopotamia, there were essentially two routes. One was down the Euphrates. That was the route taken in 401 BC. That would be a route often taken by Roman armies. The other, however, was to cross the great grasslands of eastern Syria and northern Iraq today, which the ancients would have vaguely called Assyria, and cross at the upper Tigris near the modern city of Mosul, the ancient city of Nineveh, the old capital of the Assyrian Empire, which was nothing but a mound and a memory when Alexander moved through there, and then drive down the eastern bank of the Tigris to attack from a far eastern position. That second approach required a lot more marching. It had the advantage that the army would move through areas of fine grasslands and water, but it meant about an extra 175 miles at least of marching, because it was over 200 miles from the Euphrates over to the Tigris River. Alexander kept Matthias in the dark. Eventually, when the army reached the Kabor River, which is one of the tributaries of the Euphrates, it looked like it was going to feint south and go down the Euphrates, and instead Alexander led a swift march across northern Iraq and crossed on September 18th the Tigris and came down the eastern bank of the Tigris River. That had several strategic implications because it put Alexander dangerously close to the northern Iran, and particularly the Persian capital city of Ecbatana. Furthermore, it was unexpected. Darius had hoped that Alexander would come down the Euphrates and that he would be able to fight Alexander on one of the traditional battlefields north of Babylon. Darius had assembled this enormous army at Babylon because that's where he could feed it. He had had almost 2 years to re-equip an army, to summon the satraps from the eastern provinces, notably from Central Asia, the regions of Bactris, Sogdiana. There were various Indian subject peoples. These would be peoples dwelling along the Hindu Kush. These would be Iranians also in regions which today would be southern Afghanistan, southeastern Iran. Also nomadic peoples who were Iranian speakers, vaguely called Scythians by the ancients, who were horse archers. Some of this Iranian cavalry was armed as cataphracti, that is, heavily armed warriors who could fight in close quarters with the Macedonian cavalry. This was characteristic of the Bactrians and Sogdians. Others, such as the Scythians, were nomadic horse archers. The royal cavalry of Persia itself had been rearmed with thrusting spears and heavy armor in response to fighting the Macedonians. And the idea was for them to function apparently far more as lancers rather than fighting in a general melee where they depended on scimitars and axes, which is what characterized Persian cavalry earlier. And it's an effort on Darius's part to match the Macedonian army. He had very few Greek mercenaries. He did put on the battlefield some 200 chariots, largely from the Babylonians. One wonders where he got these things. They keep using chariots. They never seem to work. We'll talk about that in the battle. There were 15 elephants from India, but there's no record of them actually participating in the battle, and we think that they may have been more for prestige rather than practical purposes. In any event, Darius had this huge army in Babylon, and the problem was how to commit it. He really didn't want to move out of Babylon until he was absolutely sure of Alexander's movements, and that only became clear to him in late September when Alexander had already crossed the Tigris without any opposition and was moving down towards the general vicinity of Babylon. At that point, Darius ordered his army north. And you have to remember that the Macedonian army could travel light. It could force march at 25 miles a day if necessary. It attained record speeds of marching, at least as understood in the ancient world. We know of no other army before and very few armies later that could march at that rate. And the Persian army, on the other hand, was lucky to move at 8 or 10 miles a day. There was a huge tent. There was all the supply system, the carts, you name it. For an army of 250,000 combatants, there were probably just as many or more people to support them, as well as the entertainment that goes along with many armies. In any case, Darius moved in the general vicinity of the Assyrian town of Arbela, near the village of Gaugamela, and there he rested his army close to the Tigris River, and he prepared the battlefield. It was an open plain, but there's nothing really known as rough, as level ground in any terrain. And he expended great effort for several days in leveling the battlefield so that his chariots could maneuver without obstruction. And On the other hand, the ground beyond the prepared field was rather rough. Alexander's army detected the Persian army late on September 30th. Alexander, with various scouts, the so-called Prodromi and other light cavalry, along with Parmenio and a number of his officers, surveyed the battlefield, and he could see Darius's army drawn up. He had a general inkling of what the army intended to do. It was obviously going to encircle and crush the smaller Macedonian army. He also observed the level fields, and at first he thought that there were traps, something known as caltropes. These are various types of devices set up with nails sticking up to wound horses, or perhaps trenches had been built. And then when he saw the Persian army, he realized what it was. It was for all the Babylonian chariots to operate on the field. He also saw that the army was overwhelmingly cavalry, that the army had essentially assumed its battle order, and he could study that order very carefully, and he knew that Darius couldn't change that order of battle overnight, that Darius was essentially committed to the plan and the order of battle. The Macedonian army retired, or the scouts and the generals in Alexander retired. The Macedonian army moved up, and Alexander ordered everyone to get a good night's sleep and held a council of generals. In that council, it is reported by Arrian that Parmenio, as many of the officers who had seen that Persian army, were in awe. This is by far the largest army yet on the field, and there were no obstructions. There was no way to prevent that army from flanking the Macedonians, at least no natural barriers. Parmenio urged a night attack, and again, this is Parmenio as the foil, and Alexander simply turned to Parmenio and said, "Alexander does not steal victory." Now, whether that happened or not, it drove home the point that Alexander depended entirely on the effectiveness and discipline of his soldiers, and that would be thrown away in a night attack. Meanwhile, Darius kept his army up virtually all night under arms, so when they went into battle the next day on the 1st of October, these guys were not happy campers. They were not having a particularly good army day, as a veteran would say. Whereas the Macedonian army arose, took breakfast, and was ready for orders early in the morning, and Alexander deliberately overslept. He got up a bit late and came out of the tent, and this is part of the conceit of generalship, almost to the effect, oh yes, we have a major battle to fight today. Now, where are we? He immediately orders his army, and the battle plan adopted by Alexander is a very, very clever way of attempting to negate that advantage of the Persian cavalry. He drew up his main battle line in classic fashion. He had his phalanx in the center. There were 6 regiments, the Hypaspists on the far right of the infantry, and then the companion cavalry. The companion cavalry, however, was screened by his Agrianians, his javelin and archers, that is the light infantry. Immediately to the right was more light infantry. And on the far left, commanded by Parmenio, were the Greek cavalry, the Thessalians, and others. They, too, were screened by archers and light infantry. And so the main line looked pretty typical. Alexander commanded the right wing, Parmenio commanded the left. However, there were 2 important innovations. He created on both sides of his army essentially flank guards, which were drawn back in echelon. The one on the right was heavily weighted. It had 3 major cavalry forces, and it was headed up as sort of a triangle with the best Greek mercenary cavalry under Menidas, who was an experienced cavalry commander, and behind them were additional infantry and light forces. On the far left, there was a similar type of triangle formation of cavalry, largely Thracian and Greek forces, and both of them were to act as guards to counter efforts by the Persian cavalry to get around the Macedonian phalanx. In addition to this innovation, the second one was drawing up the large number of Greek mercenaries and allied forces who are hoplites as essentially a second phalanx, who would be able to turn around and face any Persian cavalry that got behind the main line of Alexander. And so in a way, it was something like a box of a sort, a vague, or maybe a parallelogram, or trapezoid. We're not quite sure how it was drawn up, but the idea was to provide defense all around. Because the Persian army on the other side had enormous forces of cavalry and clearly was intending a flanking move. Darius occupied the center with the royal Persian cavalry, as was the custom of the great king. He was again standing on a great chariot so he could direct the battle line. His battle line might have stretched something like 4 miles. The length was enormous. It would be difficult for him to impose his authority on the battlefield once the battle was joined. And then on the Great Plains of Iraq in the early autumn, there would be an enormous dust cloud that would add to the confusion and the difficulty of directing military operations. He drew up his chariots on his left and right and center as screens. There were 100 of them on the left wing of the Persian army. That would be the wing facing Alexander's right. There were 50 on the right, and a group of them in the center, just in front of Darius himself. What good infantry forces he had were in the Persian center. Those were the Greek mercenaries and the household Persian forces, the so-called apple bearers. And he entrusted his wings, which were the bulk of the cavalry forces, to his 2 best satraps. On the right was Matthias, the satrap of Syria, one of the senior men who had really distinguished himself for years in the service of the great king, both of Artaxerxes III and then of Darius III. And Matthias commanded a large number of eastern forces. There was an advanced force of heavy cavalry supported by a second line. And likewise, there was a similar disposition of forces on the Persian left, commanded by Bessus, satrap of Bactria. Bactria is one of the vital northeastern provinces and home to the elite cataphractoi, that is the heavy cavalry. And the Bactrians were marshaled with Scythian forces. There were 2 big forces of each 1,000 strong in advance, drawn up next to the chariots. And then behind was a second wing of powerful cavalry forces drawn up from the eastern satrapies. So each wing had somewhere on the order of some 12,000 to 13,000 cavalry, most of them heavily armed, and their job was to swing around and take the Macedonian army in the rear. Alexander understood this. He also understood the battlefield very well, and as soon as the battle opened, once the Macedonian army was ready, he ordered his entire army to move to an oblique right and march at an angle that is threatening to flank the Persian left wing. And so the whole army, with parade precision, and Alexander loved doing this on the battlefield, showing off what his army can do in the way of drill, and the Persian army could never attempt anything like this, it began to move at an angle to the right. Now that had 2 consequences. First, Darius was surprised that there wasn't an immediate advance, an effort to attack the Persians and penetrate. And second, it was moving the Macedonian army off the level playing field, the polo ground, which had been created so the chariots could move around. Darius immediately realized that Alexander threatened to negate the chariots, and he was essentially put in the position of use them or lose them. And he immediately ordered Bessus on the left flank to send in his initial cavalry forces, Bactrians and Scythians, to stop the movement. This cavalry charged, apparently in the direction of the companions, but the various archers and javelin men shot at the oncoming Persian cavalry, and they veered to the left and smashed into the flank guard. Menidas and the Greek mercenary cavalry charged them and drove them back. A cavalry battle began to develop on the far right of Alexander's wing, and Bessus got frustrated. He threw in additional forces. Essentially, some 2,000 Iranians drove back the 500 Greek cavalry, but then the Sarissophori, the Macedonians in the wedge, they attacked. More cavalry from the left wing were fed in. The rest of the flank guard attacked, and within some 30 minutes developed a very, very brutal cavalry battle in which the Macedonians had some infantry support off to their right wing, but it was a secondary action, and it drew most of the Persian left wing into fighting that flank guard. The rest of the Macedonian army continued to move to the right. That is, the attacks launched by Bessus had not stopped the strategic movement. Now Darius, and this was probably the last order Darius really issued on the field because he had already lost the initiative and he was responding to Alexander, Darius at this point, without any other cavalry around, ordered the chariots in front of him, as well as those cavalry units in the center, to go charging and stop the companion cavalry. This large chariot force, and we believe it included the chariots on the left wing and the center, some 150 chariots, were sent towards the companion cavalry and towards the Hypaspists. The Macedonian infantry spread out in open order, shot arrows and threw javelins, and, chariots pulled by, 3 live or 2 live horses and 1 or 2 dead horses don't go very far. There was an enormous chariot wreck in front of the Macedonian army. Those chariots that got through the wreck and barreled in towards the companions in Hypaspes found themselves attacking the Macedonians, who simply opened lanes and allowed the chariots to go through them, and then closed up the ranks and allowed the light infantry to pursue them and take care of them in the backfield, so that the chariots essentially had no effect. As a result of launching that attack, Darius was precariously located in the center with only his Greek mercenaries and Persian infantry, and Alexander ordered an immediate and audacious attack of the companions, the Hypaspists, and 4 regiments of the phalanx to go after Darius in the center. Darius instantly saw, my God, I've lost another one, jumped off his chariot and rode off the battlefield, and the whole Persian center collapsed. That attack by Alexander with his right wing left his left wing under Parmenio behind, because when Bessus launched his major cavalry attacks on the left wing, Mitzias did the same on the right. And Parmenio found himself fighting a very uneven battle on his left wing, where his flank guards were essentially bypassed by part of the Persian cavalry, and for some reason, much of Mitzias' cavalry rode off several miles away to the Macedonian camp, broke into the camp, found Darius' royal family, including Darius' mother, Sisugambis, and said, "We're here to liberate you." And the Queen Mother said, "Darius who?" She had no desire to be liberated. She already had one of her daughters betrothed to Alexander, or at least being trained to marry Alexander. She wanted nothing to do with her son. So the Persians sacked the camp for a while, and many of those units were essentially off the battlefield. The others engaged Parmenio and drove him back. A gap opened up in the center. Some of the Persian cavalry ran through the gap, and they were attacked by Craterus's phalanx battalion that turned around and hit them, as well as the rear phalanx of Greeks who moved into a position to counter this move. And Alexander, who realized that Darius essentially had fled the battlefield, halted his advance and turned around with his companions and moved back into the center to relieve Parmenio. He ran into those Persian and apparently some Indian cavalry that were emerging out of the center, pursued by the back phalanx. A very, very desperate battle developed there. That was some of the most deadly fighting in the day. A number of companions fell in the fighting, and eventually those Persian Indian forces broke away and fled. By the time he relieved Parmenio, the news was out on the Persian right wing that Darius had fled and the battle was over. It was a stunning battle. It had raged on for several hours. The first 30 minutes were a very important secondary attack. The actual decisive charge was in a matter of minutes, but the fighting raged for some time on the right and left wings until the news got out that Darius had been defeated. The Battle of Gaugamela, which is really one of the masterpieces of Alexander, and a battle that has been studied ever since, especially how a small army should cope with the problem of encirclement. The Battle of Gaugamela had decisive results. Darius fled east across the Zagros Mountains in Iran, a king essentially without an army and soon without a throne. Alexander moved quickly into Babylon. He was received in jubilation. The theme of Alexander entering Babylon became a favorite of medieval, Renaissance, and early modern art in Western Europe. It was seen as the height of success. Babylon was regarded as one of the great fabulous cities of the ancient world. Babylonia, in its wealth, was only equal to, or perhaps exceeded by Egypt. Darius and the Persian army was gone. Some 25% of the Persian army was probably either killed or wounded. Losses in Alexander's army are difficult to determine. Arrian says only 100 fell, but Curtius and Diodorus give higher numbers of 300 and 500. This might include wounded and men who died in the aftermath. We are told that over 1,000 Macedonian horses died from the pursuit and the fighting. And Alexander in 330 BC will have to begin the reorganization of his cavalry, and by the time his army enters India, they are largely remounted on Iranian horses. The horses from the Mediterranean world had long since been killed off. In Babylon, Mitzias, who was the commander on the right wing and the satrap of Syria, goes over to Alexander. In Babylon, he receives Alexander as his king. Alexander makes Mitzias satrap of Babylon, and Mitzias holds that position until his death in 328 BC from natural causes. Two of his sons volunteered to serve with Alexander in the east, and they are well rewarded. It is the first sign within the Persian imperial aristocracy that Darius was now discredited. And in the next year, many more would start coming over to Alexander. And this is one of the reasons why Alexander can conquer the Persian Empire so rapidly. He receives these Persian aristocrats as noble foes, and those who come over to him are rewarded with their appropriate service of high rank. They're given positions in the civil administration. They don't command armies, but they are given high positions, and they are received at court on almost, not quite on parity with the Macedonians, but they are treated as aristocratic and noble people. Once in Babylon, Alexander and his army make a mad dash to the east in a late autumn, early winter campaign. They force what are known as the Persian Gates and enter into what is today southwestern Iran, Fars province, which is ancient Persia, the heartland itself. It is a stunning campaign. The various tribesmen in that region, known as Uxians in Greek, they attempt to block his passage and, in a sense, defend the ancient capitals. And Alexander bypasses them, secures the passes, and in early 330 BC occupies the key cities of the Persian Empire. That includes the city of Susa, which was in many ways the administrative capital of the Persian Empire, located in an ancient land known as Elam. He also occupies the ritual city of Persepolis, which was known to the Greeks as the capital of Darius I. It was the great ritual center where the various tribute was collected each year. The city itself was probably only occupied at certain times of the year, and most of the year it was largely abandoned. There was also another important city to the east of Persepolis, and that is Pasargadae. Pasargadae was built by Cyrus, the founder of the Persian dynasty, and there many of the earliest Persian kings were buried. All these cities now fall into the hands of Alexander, along with an enormous treasury. Something like 180,000 talents of silver and gold is collected among these three cities. Alexander winters in Persia. That is, he winters in the very heartland of the Persian Empire. It is a total humiliation of Darius, who at this point spends the winter in northwestern Iran trying to raise an army, has very few Greek mercenaries left, and essentially the only forces at his disposal are those from the eastern satrapies. Meanwhile, Alexander occupies and all of the key cities, the administrative centers, and at some point in early 330 BC, I believe Alexander ordered the burning of Persepolis. He really was forced to do this because as the strategos autokrator of the Hellenic League, this was the punishment expected by the Greek allies for the burning of the temples of Athens. I really think that Alexander would have preferred not to burn Persepolis. It was an impressive city. He liked Persepolis. Later on, he restored many of the Persian tombs, the royal tombs around Persepolis, but he was obligated because of his role as Greek commander. A story was put out, it's reported in Plutarch, and it was probably a very common story. Some argue it's even a cover story by Athens, by Alexander himself, that an Athenian courtesan, which is a fancy word in Greek meaning the Greek equivalent of a geisha girl, named Thais, was at the drinking session at the Persepolis Palace, and it was she, in getting the Macedonians in a drunken rage, that led Alexander, his comrades, and all the hetairi, that is the courtesans, to, let's just burn the palace down for fun. And it's a great story because it's an Athenian courtesan who does it, get the connection with Athens. And Alexander, afterwards, as the fire is burning and everyone starts to sober up, realizes, hey, this is my palace, and actually orders the flames to be put out, but it's too late. The story was very popular in antiquity. Thais has lived on in memory as the second pyromaniac coming out of Greek history. The first one, of course, torching the Temple of Artemis. But it's probably not true. I believe it was probably it really was a deliberate act. The whole story in Plutarch sounds very much similar to what Josephus tells us about the burning of the temple and the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Titus really didn't have anything to do with it. He's really a good guy. No, I think the Romans ordered the burning of the temple. They were putting down a very serious revolt. In any case, by spring of 330 BC, Alexander controlled the heartland of the Persian Empire. It was now just a matter of capturing Darius III. And therefore, in very early spring, Alexander set out on another strategic march in which he took Darius by surprise to capture the king and to end the war.